When Allied pilots first spotted the Focke-Wulf 190 inches, the skies over France in 1941, many believed it was an improved version of the Bf 109. But when the first pilot attempted to intercept it, he discovered something terrifying. He couldn't catch it, he couldn't outdive it, and he most certainly couldn't escape from it. Within weeks, the RAF would have to completely rewrite their combat manuals, not as an improvement, but as a survival measure. What the classified documents would reveal decades later would forever change our understanding of who truly dominated the European skies between 1941 and 1943. This is what the Allies really thought of the W190, and it's far darker than any documentary has ever shown you. On the 27th of September 1941, a Spitfire Mark V was conducting a routine patrol over the English Channel when its pilot spotted what appeared to be an unknown German fighter. Confident in the proven superiority of his Spitfire, he initiated pursuit. What happened next was recorded in his mission report, with one word repeated 3 times: impossible. The German fighter didn't just outrun him in level flight, something no German fighter had managed before. It also left him behind in the climb, outpaced him in the dive, and to his absolute horror, demonstrated a turn rate that rivaled the Spitfire's own. But before understanding why this encounter caused panic within British High Command, we need to grasp the context that made this moment truly catastrophic. By mid-1941, the Royal Air Force operated under an absolute certainty. The Spitfire Mark V was superior to any German fighter in service. This confidence wasn't unfounded arrogance. During the Battle of Britain, Spitfires had proved their worth against the Bf 109 seconds, and the improved versions promised to maintain that edge. British pilots flew with the reassurance that, aircraft for aircraft, they held the advantage. Fighter Command's entire tactical doctrine was built on this premise. Offensive sweeps over occupied France, bomber escorts, and interceptor tactics all assumed British fighters could dictate the terms of engagement. The appearance of the W190 didn't just challenge this assumption, it shattered it completely. Yet what truly made this aircraft devastating wasn't merely its performance. It was the timing of its arrival, and something far more sinister that wouldn't be understood until Allied intelligence finally got their hands on one. The Focke-Wulf 190's technical specifications read like a fighter pilot's fever dream, or depending on which side you were on, an absolute nightmare. Powered by a BMW 801 radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower, it achieved a top speed of 426 miles per hour at altitude, roughly 25 to 35 miles per hour, faster than the Spitfire Mark V it would face. But raw speed was only the beginning. Its rate of climb exceeded 3,000 feet per minute, allowing it to gain altitude advantage in seconds. In a dive, it could reach speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, and here's where things became truly frightening for Allied pilots. The Fu 190 remained perfectly controllable at these speeds, whilst the Spitfire's ailerons would stiffen, leaving pilots struggling to maneuver. The armament was equally brutal. 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns, all concentrated in the wings and fuselage, could tear apart any Allied aircraft with a single burst. British pilots reported that even glancing hits from an FAW 190 could prove catastrophic, whilst their own 303 machine guns seemed to merely scratch the German fighter's armoured shell. But what genuinely set the 190 apart was something engineers call power-to-weight ratio and roll rate, technical terms that translated to one simple reality in combat. If an FW 190 pilot wanted to kill you, there was very little you could do about it. The development story of the FW 190 reveals why it caught the Allies so completely off guard. Whilst British intelligence obsessively tracked every modification to the Bf 109, assuming it would remain Germany's primary fighter, Kurt Tank and his team at Focke-Wulf were quietly creating something revolutionary. The project began in 1937, the same year as the Spitfire's introduction, but took a radically different approach. Rather than refining an existing design, Tank started from scratch with one goal: create a fighter that could dominate at all altitudes and all speeds. The decision to use a radial engine rather than the inline engines favored by other designers raised eyebrows within the Luftwaffe. Radial engines were considered bulky and draggy, better suited to bombers than fighters. Tanks engineers proved the skeptics wrong by designing a remarkably streamlined cowling that actually reduced drag below that of inline-engined fighters. But the truly ingenious aspect was the aircraft's systems integration. Every control, every switch, every gauge was positioned for maximum pilot efficiency. Luftwaffe pilots transitioning from the Bf-109 reported that the FW-190 felt less like flying a machine and more like wearing one. By the time the first production models reached frontline squadrons in mid-1941, Allied intelligence still had no idea it existed. The Luftwaffe had managed to develop, test, and deploy an entirely new fighter aircraft in complete secrecy. When it finally appeared over France, it wasn't a prototype or limited production model, it was a fully operational weapon system, ready to rewrite the rules of aerial combat. The initial combat encounters between the Focke-Wulf and Allied fighters weren't battles, they were massacres. Throughout late 1941 and early 1942, RAF Fighter Command conducted offensive sweeps over occupied France, operations called Circus and Rhubarb missions, designed to draw out German fighters and destroy them. The Spitfire squadrons expected the usual duels with Bf-109 seconds, contests where skill and tactics could tip the balance. Instead, they encountered something that made tactics almost irrelevant. Squadron after squadron returned with the same horrifying reports. The W-190 seconds would position themselves above the British formations, dive through at impossible speeds, shred 2 or 3 Spitfires in seconds, then climb back to altitude before anyone could react. Attempts to pursue were futile, the 190 simply accelerated away. Attempts to evade were equally hopeless, the German fighter's roll rate meant it could follow any maneuver. The kill ratios tell the story in brutal clarity. During the first 6 months of 1942, W-190 units achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 against RAF fighters. Some individual pilots claimed ratios of 20 or even 30-to-1. These weren't propaganda figures, they were confirmed by both German and British records that remained classified until the 1980 seconds because they were simply too embarrassing to reveal. Fighter Command found itself in an impossible position. Suspending operations over France would hand the Germans a propaganda victory and leave British bomber crews without fighter cover. Continuing operations meant sending pilots into encounters where survival was becoming increasingly unlikely. But the true depth of the crisis wouldn't become apparent until Allied intelligence finally managed to test a captured Focke-Wulf, and what they discovered was somehow even worse than the combat results suggested. In June 1942, a remarkable stroke of luck handed the Allies exactly what they desperately needed. A young Luftwaffe pilot, disoriented and low on fuel, mistakenly landed his Fu-190 at RAF Pembrey in Wales, believing it to be a German airfield in occupied France. Before he could destroy the aircraft, British personnel secured it intact. Within hours, the fighter was being transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for immediate evaluation. What happened next sent shockwaves through Allied air commands on both sides of the Atlantic. The test pilots assigned to evaluate the captured Fu-190 weren't ordinary pilots. They were among the RAF's most experienced combat veterans and test pilots, men who had flown every Allied fighter type and most captured German aircraft. Their report, classified as most secret and not declassified until 1996, contained assessments that bordered on the devastating. Captain Eric Brown, Britain's chief naval test pilot, who would eventually fly more aircraft types than any pilot in history, was blunt in his evaluation. The W-190 was superior to every Allied fighter then in service. Not marginally superior, overwhelmingly so. In direct comparison trials against the Spitfire Mark V, the 190 proved faster at all altitudes, could outdive it by a significant margin, and possessed a roll rate nearly double that of the British fighter. The only area where the Spitfire maintained an advantage was turning radius, and even that advantage was slight enough that a skilled Focke-190 pilot could negate it through proper tactics. American test pilots who later evaluated the aircraft at Wright Field were equally alarmed. The 190 outperformed the P-40, outperformed early model P-47 seconds, and matched or exceeded the performance of aircraft still in development. One American report concluded with a chilling assessment. If Germany could produce this aircraft in sufficient numbers, Allied air superiority over Europe might be impossible to achieve. The psychological impact of the FW-190 on Allied pilots was something that military psychiatrists had never encountered before. In previous conflicts, even when facing superior enemy aircraft, pilots could find ways to compete through tactics, teamwork, or exploiting specific weaknesses. The W-190 offered no such consolation. It was better in almost every measurable way. And the pilots knew it. Classified RAF medical reports from 1942 and 1943 document a disturbing trend. Pilots who had previously been confident and aggressive began showing symptoms of what would later be recognized as combat stress reaction. Some requested transfers to other duties. Others developed physical symptoms before missions, psychosomatic illnesses that their doctors understood were manifestations of genuine terror. The psychological assessments, kept secret for over 40 years, reveal that some pilots required direct psychiatric intervention before they could return to operations over France. This wasn't cowardice. These were experienced combat veterans whose minds were rebelling against being sent repeatedly into encounters where survival seemed increasingly unlikely. Squadron commanders noted changes in behavior. Pilots became hesitant, more defensive, less willing to engage even when they held positional advantage. Some began breaking off combat at the mere sight of the distinctive radial engine silhouette, unable to overcome the certainty that staying meant dying. Intelligence officers documented a phenomenon they termed 190 fixation, where pilots would misidentify other German aircraft as 190 seconds, their fear causing them to see the dreaded fighter everywhere. What made this psychological crisis particularly acute was the certainty that it would get worse before it got better. New Allied fighters were in development, but deployment was months or even years away. In the meantime, pilots would have to keep flying, keep fighting, and keep dying against an aircraft that seemed nearly invincible. The tactical innovations that Allied pilots developed to survive against the W-190 read less like fighter tactics and more like desperate improvisation. Fighter Command issued new directives that essentially acknowledged the Spitfire Mark V's inferiority. Pilots were instructed to avoid combat below 20,000 feet, where the 190's performance advantage was most pronounced. They were told to never, under any circumstances, attempt to follow an FW 190 inches a dive. They were ordered to fight only in large formations, where numerical superiority might compensate for technical inferiority. Even these precautions often proved inadequate. Experienced few 190 pilots learned to exploit the Spitfire's weaknesses ruthlessly. They would feint attacks to force British pilots into defensive turns, bleeding off speed and altitude, then strike when the Spitfires were most vulnerable. The German tactic of the boom and zoom attack, diving from altitude at high speed, destroying targets, and climbing away before retaliation, proved devastatingly effective. British pilots attempted to counter by maintaining higher altitudes and tighter formations, but this defensive posture effectively surrendered the initiative to the Germans. Some squadrons experimented with extreme tactics. A few pilots deliberately flew their Spitfires at the edge of structural limits, accepting the risk of catastrophic failure in exchange for any possible performance advantage. Others adopted what were essentially guerrilla tactics, refusing direct combat and instead attempting hit-and-run attacks when circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. None of these approaches solved the fundamental problem. The Fu 190 was simply the better aircraft, and no amount of tactical cleverness could fully compensate for that raw performance gap. The situation would remain critical until new Allied fighters could be deployed in sufficient numbers, and even then, the memory of those dark months would linger in the minds of those who survived them. The impact of the W-190 extended far beyond individual combat encounters. It forced a complete reassessment of Allied fighter development and deployment priorities. The Americans accelerated production of the P-47 Thunderbolt and rushed the P-51 Mustang into service years ahead of schedule. The British fast-tracked development of the Griffon engine's Spitfire variants and the Hawker Tempest. Strategic bombing operations over Europe were scaled back until long-range escort fighters could be deployed in numbers sufficient to protect the bombers from Fu-190 attacks. The production resources diverted to counter the W-190 threat were staggering, resources that might otherwise have been used for bombers, transport aircraft, or other weapons systems. In a very real sense, the Fu-190 shaped Allied aircraft production for the remainder of the war. But perhaps the most significant legacy was what it revealed about the nature of aerial warfare. The Fu-190 demonstrated that technological superiority could trump numerical advantage, that pilot skill couldn't fully compensate for aircraft inferiority, and that air superiority wasn't a permanent condition, but something that could be lost in a matter of months if an adversary introduced a sufficiently advanced weapon system. These lessons influenced jet fighter development in the post-war era and continue to shape military aviation doctrine today. By late 1943, the tide finally began to turn. The Spitfire Mark IX, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-51 Mustang reached frontline squadrons in substantial numbers, aircraft that could finally meet the W-190 on roughly equal terms. The kill ratios began to shift as Allied numerical superiority and improved aircraft eroded the 190's dominance. But those 2 years between mid-1941 and late 1943 had been catastrophic. Thousands of Allied pilots had been killed or captured, facing an aircraft that their own fighters simply couldn't match. The psychological scars remained even after better aircraft arrived. The Fu-190 had shattered the myth of inevitable Allied technological superiority and proved that Germany, even whilst fighting a multi-front war, could still produce weapons that shocked the world. The documents that remained classified for decades after the war paint a picture far different from the one presented in popular histories. The Allies didn't gradually overcome German fighters through superior tactics and determination. For 2 crucial years, they were being systematically slaughtered by an aircraft so superior that survival often came down to luck rather than skill. The pilots who faced the Fu-190 and lived carried a respect for that aircraft that bordered on reverence. They knew what historians would later confirm. The Focke-Wulf 190 wasn't just another fighter, it was one of the finest combat aircraft of the entire war, and facing it required a kind of courage that few outside of aerial combat could truly understand. The fork-tailed Lightning earned its reputation in the Pacific, but in the skies over Europe, it was the radial-engined devil that rewrote the rules and nearly changed the outcome of the air war itself.